What's up, everybody? All right, so let's see how we can do this live stream thing. I've never done this before, so let's see what we can get away with. Hello, Pastor Michael. Hello, Pastor Michael.
Yeah, sorry. Literally, the second you went live, my internet was like, nope.
Internet decided to take a crap. So let's start off with, I got some new intro music. So, you want to check out my new intro music?
Yeah.
You don't really get a choice.
God in his fullness, hidden for ages, now revealed.
Thank you, Jordan Pride, for the new intro music. Find that wherever you guys stream your music at, Spotify, Apple Music, and you can find that. Okay. I was going to wait a few minutes here and wait for maybe a few people to pop in. That way I can also figure out what I'm doing with all these buttons that I have to play with now, because I know how to play with these buttons. I got lots of buttons that I don't know how to use. Okay. Well,
so you're still picking up my speech and everything, right?
I mean, I can, but all right. I can't hear.
Are you hearing me at all?
It helps. Okay, let me turn you up.
I didn't think you could hear me.
Now I can hear you. I keep turning you down. I'm using the same slide for everything. That's what happened. So, interesting topic tonight. At least interesting for me, maybe. I don't know if it's going to be interesting for everybody else. A couple of months ago, I was at a conference that you spoke at. Completely off topic from what we're going to talk about tonight. But at this conference, we talked about, in a side conversation, I heard the comment made, and I'd never heard this before. I heard someone make the comment, the statement was a belief of Paedobaptism in the Reformed view. And I had no idea what those words meant. I know all of those words, but I don't know what all of those words mean together. And I've been trying to figure out exactly what that meant.
Yeah.
So, for background, I'm not Reformed at all. I'm not an Arminian either. A lot of people like to say I'm a biblicist. But you are one of my few Reformed friends. So I said, talk to me like I'm 5 and explain this to me, because we're talking tonight about the difference in credobaptism and paedobaptism, or to simplify that, should we baptize children? Should we baptize babies? And if that is, if we should baptize babies, exactly in what manner should we? And where does that align with Scripture? Because I would go to say the general belief and the general understanding amongst evangelicals is what we would call believer's baptism. Baptism being an act that is done post-salvation, that is a decision that is made. I wrote an article about this, a short article a while back that I put on Facebook, kind of addressing this. And in that, I said that the believer should have a desire to be baptized. A lack of a desire for that should be a clear indication of concern for a person's baptism or a person's salvation if they don't have a desire to be baptized, and that we can see biblically that baptism is that first move in an obedient walk with Christ. Even Christ was baptized by John the Baptist. in that demonstration of putting on the wholeness of God in that moment where the Spirit descended. But that was the first move before he went into his public ministry. So that's kind of the context of baptism that I think probably most evangelicals hold. Maybe I'm stepping out further than I should by saying most, but I would say that most hold that. One of the practices that you do not see in evangelical circles is the baptizing of children. You see that in Presbyterian circles. You see that in, really you see that a lot in Catholic circles. And you see that in Lutheran circles, but you don't hardly ever see that in a Baptist circle. By
definition.
I guess I have more questions than I have anything, because I don't understand where anyone would ever come through and get the idea of baptizing children. I don't see a biblical precedent for it. I don't see it done in Scripture. And I have a really hard time coming up with how this is acceptable practice. So that's kind of what we're going to try to tap into tonight. Are you still there?
Yeah, I've got you. I think I've got some lag going on.
That's okay. I think we can hear you okay. We just can't. Your video is going to be in and out, but we can hear you okay.
Yeah. See. Okay. If it's all the same, I can just stop the same. I can just stop the sound because I'm not doing some. I help the connection a little better.
Sure. If you want to do that, that's fine.
Just do that.
It's a very lovely picture.
Yeah, probably a better thing to look at anyway.
So, Pastor Michael, I'm going to go ahead and just throw you the ball, and let you kind of walk me through a little bit of this. And for anyone that's watching, if you're on Facebook, you're on YouTube, if you need to jump in with any questions, just type those into the chat, and we can see those, and we'll try to address as much of that as we can. So I'm going to go ahead and toss you the ball.
Yeah, so I want to preface it first by saying I'm a Baptist, so I'm going to try to steelman this as much as I can. I don't want to pretend that I'm Paedobaptist because I'm not, but I'm going to do everything that I can to rightly present this view without straw manning it. Are you picking me up pretty well?
Yeah, sorry. I've got my mic muted so I can just pay attention.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't just over here talking to myself.
Nope.
Okay, cool. So with that disclaimer kind of out of the way, to say that we have a doctrine of Paedobaptism that is foreign tradition specifically. That's to refer to the fact that the Reformed people follow three C's. So first of all, if you're Reformed, you're Calvinist. Okay, so you know what that means. You know what that means, and most of everybody is probably in a different community. Different community has some sort of an aversion to that. The people that are in it just love Calvinism. They wish that there were seven. Believe all seven.
Right. We call them heretics. I'm kidding.
Right. So that's the first C. Calvinism. The second C is confessionalism. Generally, they believe some sort of a historical confession. So if you're Presbyterian, believe in the Westminster Confession. If you're Lutheran, believe in the Augsburg Confession. If you're Baptist, believe in the London Baptist Confession. So that's the second C of being Reformed is your confessional. And third C is your covenantal. To be covenantal, you believe in at least two the covenants, which is the covenant of works, and secondly the covenant of grace. Most covenantalists today believe in also a third covenant, the covenant of redemption. So I'll cover those. The first one, technically in the chronology, was the covenant of redemption, which was made among them by themselves. The Father agreed, redeemed by sending his Son. The Son agreed to go and die in our place. The Holy Spirit agreed to be sent by the Son. And so the members of the Trinity. Second covenant is the covenant of works. That's what was struck up with Adam. So God says, "Don't eat of this tree. You'll live forever. But if you eat of the tree, you'll die." That's pretty straightforward. That's you do this. This happens. You don't do this. That happens. That happens. Covenant. Of course, Adam failed. Fell into sin. Eve fell into sin with him. We all fell through them. And so the covenant of works broke apart because of our sin. So God, instead of sending us all to hell, struck up a new covenant, which was the covenant of grace, where He showed us grace. See that Genesis says, through the seed of the woman, I will bring a redeemer, more or less. He will crush the head of the snake. The snake will bruise his heel. And so He promises the Messiah, the Redeemer. And that's the initiation of the covenant of grace. And we've been under the covenant of grace ever since. All people of all time have been born and have only received salvation, have had a relationship with God by grace. We don't believe that it was ever the case that somebody was redeemed, or justified before God by their works, by the blood of Son, the animal that had been slaughtered. And so you have those covenants. So you get into the Old Testament, and God gives signs for His covenants. So with Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, He tells Abraham to initiate this sign, the circumcision. And the sign of the covenant specifically was applied to all the people that were members of God's family, the people of God, chosen people of God. There's a testament that was ethnic and national Israel, right? The children of Abraham. Mm-hmm. And that was the sign of that covenant, just like the Noahic covenant was the rainbow. Okay. So Abraham signed it's circumcision, and this sign particularly relates to God's people, and it's applied to God's people so that you can recognize who God's people are. That was the point of circumcision, was to set you apart, to show the world, you're my people. This is how you recognize my people. They do this very weird thing, and they're going to be marked out by it. Something you wouldn't do unless you were a member of my people. Well, you get to the New Testament, and you have new covenant. Jeremiah 31 tells us the coming. Christ initiates the new covenant. This is the new covenant, my blood. And so with a new covenant comes a new sign. You're following everything good there.
I'm still with you.
So far.
I'm still with you.
Okay. So new covenant brings a new sign. The purpose of the sign is exactly the same. The purpose of the sign is to mark you out. This is a member of God's people. This is how you recognize a member of God's covenant. The people who are the family of God. We call it the church. In the New Testament. And so the sign is baptism, right? So if you want to be a member of God's covenant, if you want to be part of the family of God, it's not being circumcised circumcised that makes you a member of God's family in the Old Testament. It's being a Jew. It's being a Hebrew. It's being an Israelite. That's what makes you a member of God's family. And there was a process through which you could join the Israelites, even the Gentile in the Old Testament. That's a long story we can get into if you want to go down that road. But it included circumcision. That wasn't all. That was just the time. That was just in the same way. In the same way, being baptized doesn't impart salvation to you. It's just a recognition. It's a sign that you're a member that you're a covenant family of God.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see my Baptist there. Anyway. So in the New Testament, you have baptism in the Old Testament. Circumcision was the sign. In the New Testament, there's no explicit command that do not baptize children. Do not apply this sign to children. There's no explicit command saying that. We draw implications. There's very clear implications. I wouldn't be a Baptist if I didn't believe that there were clear implications. And the practice seems necessarily for adults, or at least people making a believing confession. But there is no explicit command. Do not apply the sign to children. And so in the Reformed community, we believe that Scripture interprets Scripture. And where there is silence elsewhere in Scripture for such a similar practice, and you try to interpret what you're supposed to do based on what has been commanded elsewhere. And when you're looking at the sign of baptism, and you say, should this be applied to children? We say, well, the New Testament is silent on that issue. It doesn't say to apply it to children. It doesn't say not to apply it to children. So we look at in the Old Testament when you had the sign of the covenant, it was circumcision. Does it apply to children? You go back to 12, and God says specifically, apply the sign to your children. Not just children after they make a profession, or literally join the Israelite family. Do it to them on the 8th day of their life. And so Presbyterians and the like say, okay, in the Old Testament, apply to children. In the New Testament, we don't have anything telling us to change that practice. So why would we? And so that's more or less the warrant. The meaning of it is a little more nuance. But the warrant for it is pretty much that. That in the Old Testament, the sign of being a member of God's covenant was applied to the children in that community. The week they were born. And the New Testament should be the same because we don't have anything telling us to stop doing that.
So, where I get lost in the weeds here is, if we're baptizing children and we're doing it kind of as the New Testament replacement of circumcision, there's quite some differences to deal with here. First of all, circumcision was not beyond the circumcision. It wasn't public. I mean, circumcision, circumcision is a very personal sign because, there's still debate over the relevancy of it, because people in public aren't going to see that. So, what was the point? And it was kind of used as one of those things of, I can look at myself and see that I've had that part of me cut off, and the spiritual cutting off, and, that alignment with God. So then you end up in the discussion of, well, then how does a person know that you're one of God's chosen people? Well, it's, it goes beyond that physical thing. So if you apply that same ideology to baptism, baptism being very public. In fact, baptism was so public when John was baptizing people, the day that Christ himself was baptized. This was a really interesting historical moment for the Jew, you realize that you've got a bunch of Jewish people in this area. So picture a town full of Jewish people, and they knew what baptism was. Baptism was established long prior to Christian baptism, long before John was baptizing people. The Jews were baptizing themselves all the time. They had these ritual cleansings that they would go through, where they would wash themselves in these pools. So whenever a person would become a Jew, if you were a Gentile and you converted to Judaism, you would have to go through a ritual cleansing, which would be a baptism. So in order to go from being a Jew to being baptized by John was a slap in the face to their entire belief structure, and could actually go to the extent to cause divides. I mean, parents may completely disown you for what you just did because, you're a Jew. You don't just insult every part of our heritage by, being baptized into a Gentile belief system. So, the people that were baptized by John were really making life-altering decisions in their baptism. It wasn't just I decided to follow Jesus and now I want to do this like we do it. This was a public, life-altering decision that once you did it, you may not ever be able to go back. So that's a big thing. Talk about a stark contrast between the very, very, very intimate and personal message that a boy's circumcision would give versus the completely outward, life-altering event of being baptized into a Gentile belief system out of the Jewish belief system.
Well, yeah, there's a whole background to John's baptism. John's baptism is kind of foreign to modern Christians. The baptism of John the Baptist was a very different thing than the baptism that we practice today. Because John was deriving it from Jewish practice. As you mentioned, as you wanted to become a member of the nation of Israel as a Gentile, there was a process through which you go. And it wasn't just a washing thing. If you were a man, you would have to be circumcised in order to join. And one of the things that they would do in the temple, they had these pools in the corner of the outermost yard. They were called mitzvah, spelled M-I-T-Z-V-E-H. And the plural of it, I think, is mitzvah. I don't know a tremendous amount about the origin of those. Some people say that it goes back to Moses. Apparently, he washed himself before he went up on a mountain. That's where it came from. But if you wanted to become a member of the nation of Israel, you would be circumcised, time to heal, and then you would go. You would have to be washed in those. And one element that's somewhat similar to our baptismal rite is you would have to have witnesses that were Israelites come and watch you dunk yourself in that pool, and they would have to testify if you were a man that you had been circumcised. They would have to testify that your entire body went underwater. And so there was an element. So there was an element to play devil's advocate. You could say it was just as much an element of worship inside the family of God as baptism is now, because we don't baptize out in the rivers, in the baptismal pool in the church house. Most people do. So there's play devil's advocate with that. Mikvah. So when John goes outside the temple, and he's calling people to come get baptized. Specifically, he's calling for leaders of the temple to come get. What he's saying, you're not members of the family of God. That's telling, because to get baptized was a statement that said we are outside of the covenant community. We are Gentiles of Israel of God. And so he starts commanding Jews to come down and get baptized. The statement being, you are not in God's people. You are just as far away from God as the Gentiles are. And so you could there's a kind of a blurring of circumcision and baptism in the time of John. Now certainly it is a different thing when you get to post ascension. But the distinction between circumcision and baptism is kind of blurry there as far as the public element of it. So I don't know that would be a argument. I think that you point out the big reason that I'm sold on baptism as a Baptist is the lack of precedent for it, and the seemingly different meaning. In the Old Testament, if you were circumcised, it seems that you were just accepted as being of God's covenant community on the basis of the fact that you were circumcised and your blood was Jewish. Mm-hmm. In the New Testament, if somebody has taken a bath.
Uh-oh. I think we lost Michael here for a second.
Is your public profession.
There he is. Hey, Michael, we
want to see the fruit of the Spirit in your life. The baptism is meaningful, but not as a means of confirming that you're a member of the covenant community or the people of God. In that respect, it's completely different from circumcision. And as a recognition of your public profession in that sense, it has to be made by people that have a public profession. Mm-hmm. Not babies.
Right. So in the Reformed tradition, well, let me rephrase that. I had a conversation a while back, and this is another episode that you guys can go back and listen to if you have a couple hours free, because it was a long conversation. But I talked with Pastor Eric Johnson, who is a Lutheran pastor, and obviously they do practice Paedobaptism, and almost solely Paedobaptism. And to be honest, I had a little trouble following the way he was explaining it, because he was trying to make the argument that there is no New Testament precedent for it, because there had never, it hadn't been brought to fruition for a reason for that yet. And made the argument that they baptize, the way he said it was, I think that they baptize into salvation. So there's a coming of knowledge later where they I see, and I'm having trouble reiterating it because it was hard to follow. It was and I don't
disregard the means of grace.
Yeah.
Have you heard that phrase?
Yeah.
Have you heard that phrase, means of grace?
I don't think so. I said when we started, talk to me like I'm five.
Is a very reformed thing. You won't hear it in non-reformed circles. So let me explain it this way. And this will be a part that we don't like to say out loud as pastors, but it's true. Nevertheless, we have to admit it. You can be a Christian and not read the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that says in order to be a Christian, you have to read the Bible all the time, and not go to heaven, read the Bible. That's not in there. We're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. And so reading the Bible is compulsory for salvation.
Right.
But you will not be a mature Christian. You will not be very sanctified. You will not be very close to God if you don't read the Bible. In the same way, again, I hate to say it out loud, but it's the truth. If you don't go to church, that does not mean you're going to hell. You can be a Christian and not go to church. And we always want to qualify that and say, but no, grace alone, faith alone, Christ alone. Going to church is not compulsory for salvation. But you will not be a mature Christian. You will not be sanctified. You will not be as close to God as you should be. Go to church. And so things like reading the Bible, going to church, praying, even singing worship, listening to preaching, those things are means of grace. That's an avenue through which God draws you closer to Him. You receive grace through literally participating in these things. You become closer to God by participating in them. That's what it means to say that that's a means of grace. So in the Reformed tradition, taking communion is a means of grace, and being baptized is a means of grace. These are not things that save you, not things that make sure that you're in the covenant community, but they are things that bring you closer to God. So again, reading the Bible, praying, going to church, singing worship, listening to preaching. Those things don't save you. They don't make sure that you're saved, but they bring you closer to God. And so baptism similarly is a thing that doesn't save you, but it brings you closer to God by having done it. And so in a Paedobaptist community, they might argue that we're not saving the child. There's nothing salvific in the baptism. Of course, a Catholic, I'm pretty sure Catholics actually believe there's some impartation of salvation in the baptism of a baby.
Yes.
Or at least historically, that might have been the case. I don't know what now. The Pope can just change the rules whenever he wants. But
my grandfather, I will say this real quick. My grandfather was Catholic. He passed away when I was 15. But he was a devout and open atheist. Yet at his funeral, it was the first and only Catholic funeral I have ever been in. At his funeral, I remember the priest making this declaration that because he was baptized as an infant, that he is with God. And at the age that I was when my granddad died, I knew that my granddad was not in heaven, that he did not know Jesus, and that this was complete garbage. So yeah, that belief is still, at least in that context, in that particular funeral from that particular priest, that was the message that was conveyed, was the infant baptism was the means of salvation.
Yeah, and Lutherans and Presbyterians. I want to think. I don't know this for certain. I have heard of Methodists performing infant baptisms. They call it something different. I think they call it a christening, which the word christen means to make Christian. So I don't know why they would even go about the problem. The issue of using a different word if it means the same thing. But I know that those traditions, Lutheran, Presbyterian, perhaps the Methodist, don't believe that it imparts salvation. But I do think that it would be fair to say that it's a means of grace. That you're setting your child in an advantageous position in their relationship to God. You bring them closer to God. In the same way that a Baptist, we know that our children are Christians when they're born, but we raise them like they are. We teach them the Bible. We teach hymns. We teach pray, even though they're not Christians. And the hope is that by doing these things, God will work in their lives and save them. So we recognize that perhaps implicitly, but we just don't practice infant baptism because we don't see that. That's precedent set in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. So when we say
Sorry, I don't have audio.
I had my mic,
There you go.
because
There you
I
go.
pushed a button and I muted myself for that entire time. So, yeah, Chance, I see you in the chat, bro. Stay there, would you, bro? Because you're actually helping me a lot. I got a brother in the chat that's like giving me, trying to give us some audio help. So in the Reformed tradition, there's a belief of pedobaptism. So I suppose my question is, if it's not salvific, what is it? And what's the point? And how do they reconcile it with the New Testament in the obvious only demonstration of baptism for a Christian being a mature believer post-salvation?
Oh yeah, I think they would disagree with that statement out of the gate. And they would appeal to household baptisms. I'm sure you've read these. Every Baptist has had to contend with these. Because there are situations, specifically according to he Christian, his whole household gets baptized. I don't know if it was Peter or Paul, but one of them preaches repent and believe the gospel and be baptized in your household. Might have been jailer that he said that too. So they take that as being implicit of infant baptism. That regardless of whether the people in the household have become Christian or not, you go ahead and you baptize the children of a believer in the same way that the head of household in the Old Testament would have his children circumcised, whether they were Israelites or not. And so I think Paedobaptist would, of course, appeal to that right out of the gate. There's a distinction of an interpretation in the New Testament. Now, to be fair, the practice of Paedobaptism arose really early in the church. It's not something where we can say, well, that didn't come up in the council of such and such. They started practicing Paedobaptism probably within the first two centuries. If you look at early frescoes and painting baptism all the time, adults, or at least people that we would consider old enough to have made a faith. But there's written accounts of people that had their children baptized, or at least water on. Because what was happening was children were dying on their deathbeds, so they started worrying about their salvation because they didn't understand. Well, this will get into another doctrine. In the most Baptist churches believe in the age of accountability. Most Reformed community doesn't. They believe in the doctrine of election so firmly that Reformed confessions have for example, I've got the Second London Baptist Confession here. One of the more let me look this up real quickly. Let's see here. I should know it by heart, right? There's a. I'm not gonna sit here and bicker over it. But there's a article in the London Baptist Confession, and it was taken directly from the Westminster Confession that says, "Elect infants who die in infancy," and it talks about how they go to heaven. Which the implication being that there are infants who are not elect, and therefore babies that die and go to hell. And as somebody that believes in the age of accountability, I can't swallow that. And so that's one of the big hiccups with some of the old historical confessions is it has this article that says elect infants who die in infancy go to heaven. And so the only way that we can skirt our way around that is to say, yeah, they do. And all of the infants that die are elect. Of course, that's assumption that we don't really have the ability to make. So I don't like that at all. But the reasoning for doing Paedobaptism, other than just it's the same command that we have in the Old Testament. For whatever reason, God told Abraham to have his son circumcised, even on the eighth day of their life. We don't have a real reason why. So in the New Testament, they say we don't really need a reason. We wouldn't do it. Now they might say again, it's a means of grace. Children to an advantage position in their relationship with God, even before they're saved, they have been given a step up. So Chance is quoting the Canon of Dort there. And the Canon of Dort, what that was just Calvinists getting together to respond to Arminianism, and that's probably where that whole line about elect comes from. I'm sure that's probably where its origin is found. So they had something about this that they had to come up with, because you don't want to say that. Gosh, there's a whole argument you can get into about infants that die in election. Now I do want to say one thing about this. There's a radical end of the Paedobaptist wing where people they're not saying that infant baptism saves you, but it's certainly an implication. There's a guy named Doug Wilson out in Moscow, Idaho. And I'll go ahead and out myself before I even start talking about this. I don't care for him. The more that I learn, it's like Hitler. The more I learn about him, the less I don't like him. The less I like him.
Wow.
Right?
That might be the statement of the night right there.
I don't really care for this person. Yeah. I know Hitler's a hard comparison, but it's I'm a historian, so you don't read about bad people a lot. You read about the good ones. But Doug Wilson has this analogy where he says if you have two black ants and they have a baby ant, what color will the ant be? And he says, of course, the ant will be black. And then he says, if you have two red ants, and they have a baby, what color will the ant be? And it's a red ant. And so he says, if two Christians get together, and they have a baby, then what will the baby be? And we say the baby is a baby until the baby becomes a Christian. It's a Christian. But I don't know what he's saying when he says that. But I heard him say that, and I thought, this guy's bananas. That to think that's how that works. He has a lot of stuff on that is very radical for the Paedobaptist community. He definitely doesn't represent the mainstream anything that he believes. But that one really shocked me. I've been tempted by the Paedobaptist argument before. And when I hear stuff like that, I get shocked right back out of it. I just think, oh no, you guys are crazy.
Yeah. I don't know. Again, talk about faulty logic, with the whole ant thing. Because you're talking about genetics versus spirit birth there. And it's almost, that's really skirting along the line of, the whole Jewish belief of if you're born a Jew, then you're born a Jew in blood and in spirit. That's a dangerous territory to get into. That's a really, really dangerous thing to dabble in.
Right, because you can, as a pastor, I can see him consoling some family. Like my wife and I lost a baby last year, and we have complete confidence that the child's in heaven, but not because we had the child baptized.
Right.
And if I'm one of these guys, Paedobaptist, and I'm trying to console somebody that has lost a child before they make public profession, and I'm saying, well, look, take hope, because you had them baptized.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see myself honestly looking at the Bible and saying that's something that should be even factored in. Because gosh, we live in the South. 70 to 80% of the people in our community have been baptized, and maybe 5-10% of them are actually Christians.
Yeah,
so it's like that clearly is not correlative.
Not to mention the fact that in that instance, you are completely putting the salvation of the child in the hands of the parent.
Yeah, and again, I want to be careful because I don't think that most Paedobaptists, being Presbyterians or Lutherans, I don't think they would go down that road. I really don't. But it's like you're asking, what's the point then? If there's absolutely no assurance from it, then why are we doing this? Because it's a means of grace, and that grace to put you in an elevated position. I don't get it. I mean, like I said, I'm a Baptist, so of course I'm not going to get it. But let's look at what Chance is saying.
Yeah, Chance here said, wouldn't you say covenant children are blessed being born into a Christian family? You can read in Romans where it states not all Israel is Israel. So I believe that we'll say Presbyterians would say not all covenant children are Christians. Yes, but again, we're talking about, the thing that I'm really trying to be careful with here, and like Michael just said, with, I don't think that most of, at least the Presbyterians and the Reformed viewers of pedobaptism, outside of the the Orthodox Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church, their beliefs would act. I don't believe that most of them would actually say that there is a salvific tie to the person, and that by me having my children baptized, that's saving them. Again, I wish I could remember the words. Chance here said the Lutheran Church would. Yes, they would. I don't understand how you get there. I don't understand how you biblically get there, and that's kind of what we've been talking about. How do you get to that idea of it being salvific? And I think what we're talking about here is, obviously it's not salvific, but at the same token, there's a lot of language and there's a lot of rhetoric that kind of gives it a salvific light, and it points toward a salvific thing, like, with the whole, well, your baby's in heaven because it was baptized. Well, according to that logic, if the baby wasn't baptized, then it went to hell. And as long as the baby is baptized, then it always gets to go to heaven. Now we're baptizing children into heaven, and we're making a bunch of Christians without any responsibility on their end. But then you have this idea that would kick in later of, well, if a person's life doesn't represent Christ, and if they don't ever live a life that proves that salvation moment in their infant baptism, then that proves that they were not, that they're not one of God's children. Then that leads me to the further hypothesis of, now you're creating this idea almost of a special grace. Like every person has their own little version of grace. Every person is saved in their own little way, and there's no standard. There's no biblical standard to set upon mankind, when in Scripture it gives us the standard of salvation. It gives us, what must I do to be saved? Or say, by grace through faith, not of ourselves. So I think if you go down this road of trying to, in some fashion, justify pedobaptism, then what you end up doing is you end up painting yourself into a corner, because you've created all these other ideas now, maybe not on purposely, but at least inadvertently, you've created all these new ideals, and you've got to explain that.
Yeah, and it seems like the kind of thing that maybe might have been brought up in the Bible.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
With if they were doing this in the time of Peter and Paul and James and John, somebody might have asked one of these questions. They might have said, "Hey, what does this mean? Why are we doing this to our kids? What difference is this making in the lives of our children?" And then they might have spent a little more time explaining what the meaning of baptism is. But when baptism is addressed in the New Testament, it seems to be taken for granted that the person being baptized has already made a profession of faith. That seems to be taken as something that is assumed. And so there's never a question of, well, what do we do for somebody who has never made a profession of faith and yet has been baptized? What's the case for them? That's never brought up. One of the things that Chance mentioned in an earlier comment when he talked about not all Israel is Israel, that's actually a really important thing to bring up in the discussion of Paedobaptism. And I know he's got something new here. You have to land there with a faulty view of the covenants. I believe this was the path of the Reformation to bridge the Catholic faith and Presbyterian faith. I believe this is one of the greatest errors in the Reformation. Yeah, there were some elements that they didn't want to let go of, and that's unapologetically. Luther and Calvin had several things that they did not want to let go of from their Catholic background, Zwingli as well. So these guys that led the Reformation in those first few centuries, they really had some stuff that they did not want to let go of, the first few decades rather, that they didn't want to let go of. And it's the same thing with communion. So when Luther comes out of the Catholic tradition and he says, well, no, there aren't 7 sacraments, there are only 2. It's the Lord's Supper and baptism. And then somebody says, okay, so what does the Lord's Supper mean? And he says, it means exactly what the Catholics said it was. And they're like, no, that can't be right. He's like, okay, yeah, it's a little different. Because they believe in transubstantiation. And he says, well, no, it's not transubstantiation, it's consubstantiation. And nobody, I mean, Calvin disagreed with that. Zwingli absolutely disagreed with that. But he wasn't willing to let go of this substantial element, communion. And none of them let go of Paedobaptism. So you end up with anybody that disagrees on the issue of Paedobaptism, they just threw them out immediately. The Anabaptists come out. Although they weren't the first ones to do it. If you read it, there's a crazy book by a crazy guy called Trail of Blood. I forget his name now. But he contends that Baptists have always been here, going back to like the Waldenses or something or another. And so he says, Baptists have always been here. You can believe whatever you want about that, but certainly after the Reformation was sparked, they were defensive about Paedobaptism and never got off of it. And so it's one of those things where you have to look at the Reformation and say, okay, were they done reforming? Because they were willing to say, well, no, marriage is in the sacrament. And there's several others, but there were some of these things that were sacraments, and baptism were, but we're going to do them exactly how Catholics did them. Yeah, Chance has got it right. It's poor history. The guy was completely wackadoo. So. And he contended that, this is an old SBC thing too. They used to contend that the Baptist came out of the Anabaptist. And most everybody agrees that that's not the case. We came out of a different stream out of England. If you want to see modern day Anabaptist, you look at the Mennonites. That's modern day Anabaptist.
Yeah, we came out of a stream, like you said, out of England. That really it came out of England, and then I think even that kind of dissipated. And then was it in Georgia or Alabama that our modern, at least Southern Baptist denomination kind of sprouted out of later? The American Baptist that we are thinking about.
The modern Baptists were pretty early. I mean, the colony of Rhode Island was planted by Baptists. Brown University was originally a Baptist university, and that was pretty early in American history. But as far as the SBC goes, that comes the 1840s. As we were trying to figure. And that's an interesting thing too about the confessions is we had the 1689 London Baptist Confession, and then they came to America and they thought that holding to a British confession was too British, and so they had to write a new one. And so they came up with, I think they came up with the Philadelphia Confession first, and then came up with another one called the New Hampshire. And those two confessions were used as the baseline for the original SBC confession. And so that's a pretty straight line coming out of the English Baptist tradition for the SBC. Of course, it abandoned everything Calvinist in the 1900s in the wake of Billy Graham and others like him. But there's a pretty straight line there.
So I think you and I agree that we don't need to be baptizing babies.
Right. Yeah.
I think we can agree with that, and I think honestly we can make the clear biblical stance that we don't need to be baptizing babies. In fact, there were some friends of mine. They were having a baby, and they asked me. The dad asked me, hey, whenever the baby's born, would you baptize him? And I immediately said no. And he looked at me like, what? Because this is a really good friend of mine. And I said no, because this wasn't a man that was saved. This wasn't a man that was faithful to Scripture. And I said, because me baptizing your baby doesn't do anything except get the baby wet and make you feel good. It does nothing eternally for that child. I said, now, if you want me to, I don't mind to anoint the baby and pray over it and, pray the favor of God over it and pray for God to bless. We can do that. But I'm not baptizing it. And so we had this, it was clear he kind of had this, at least Lutheran or Catholic-ish idea in mind of, a religious ceremony. And he told me that. He's like, well, I just wanted to, make sure that my kid's okay with God, more or less. And I said, well, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is for you to follow Christ and then you to lead your children when they're old enough to understand and appreciate what it is you're presenting them. Not to do a deed that is completely outside of their ability to comprehend, far outside of their consciousness, and then expect that to have some mystical effect later. I think not only that, I think not only does it put the salvific power in the hands of the parent, I think it takes the responsibility away from the child, and now you're saying, well, your salvation is dependent upon what your mom and dad did. If your mom and dad didn't have you baptized, and you're sorry, out of luck. Hope you find God later in life. Well, now we're talking about that special grace idea again, and where's the standard? But you also end up taking the responsibility away from people, and then that trains up a generation to believe, hey, mom and dad had me baptized, I'm good to go. But then you end up, in Romans 6, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. That text talks about being baptized into Christ and being baptized into his death. But it also talks about having a responsibility with how we live our life in response to grace. And you don't have that responsibility if you're baptized as an infant. You're robbed of that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty strong. But I'm not disagreeing with you. But that's a pretty strong way of putting it. Because I don't know that a Paedobaptist would see it that way. They'd want to defend against that. I'm not going to go down that road because I don't want to be unfair. Because I have being reformed. Some of the best people that I'm around aren't Baptists. Most of them aren't. But I do think that that's an error. I'm certainly with you that that's an error and that it's dangerous, like you're saying, to set that precedent. And I've even encountered some pretty belligerent Presbyterians that say, the Baptist denomination is the only denomination that doesn't baptize their kids, and look at their kids. And they say, you see a guy, the most poorly behaved children in the world are the Baptist pastor's children. So they say, well, it's no wonder that their kids are such deviants. They're not baptizing them, and that's not fair either.
I'd like to see a study with those numbers of, unbaptized Baptist children and their criminal records versus the criminal records of baptized Catholics. I'm just curious to see what the numbers would look like.
Yeah. But one thing that a Paedobaptist would bring up for us is, you mentioned I would be comfortable anointing the child and praying over it. And our church and most SBC churches, they're comfortable doing baby dedications.
Yeah.
And I say, well, what the heck? That's no different. Like, they say that's the same thing. And so we say, no, that's very different. And one of the things that I like to say when we do a baby dedication is I always say, we don't wet babies wet themselves. We don't have to go down that road. So they'll take care of that on their own. But we do have to be more clear as Baptists about what a baby dedication is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've heard some people they justify baby dedications by going to Samuel, and they'll read about how Samuel's mother prayed to God and said, if you'll give me a child, I'll give him back to you, and he'll just serve you forever. If you'll just give me a child, he'll just be yours. And so they say, that's what we're doing in a baby dedication. Is we're just giving the baby back to God for having given them to this family. And I think, I don't know. That sounds close to baby baptism. That's what that sounds like. And then I've heard other people say, well, no, it's not even about the baby. It's the family asking for the church that they're a part of to commit to help them to raise this baby in the spirit and the admonition of the Lord, to serve as a covenant community around them, to pray for them, to strengthen them, and do all those things. And I like that better. That's what we say at our church whenever we do a baby dedication, is that this is hardly even related to what's happening with the baby. This is more of a parent dedication. The parents are dedicating to raise their children in a Christian household, and they want the church to hold them accountable and help them do that. But I think that Baptists need to be a lot more clear about that, because when we have a baby up there and we have a family getting a certificate, and we're saying, your baby's been dedicated to the house of God, let's all give them a hand of applause, and we'll say a prayer over this baby. The only thing that's missing is a couple of drops of water on the baby's head. We're really splitting hairs.
Maybe, but I think we could be splitting hairs, but I think we also could be looking at two very different things that are prescribed in Scripture. One of the things prescribed in Scripture was anointing, and you have to, I guess, kind of give a quick lesson on the purpose of anointing with oil, and that oil represented, and again, it was representative. It was not literal. It was a representation of the empowerment of the Spirit of God. Water in baptism was, taken from the ritual cleansings of the Jews, and it was symbolic of what was being done inward for the believer, but it was that dying and being risen again structure that was shown in the water. That's why the word, and again, and we can get into this too, we're talking about baptizing babies, but we're really not, because we're talking about sprinkling a couple of drops of water on a baby, not baptizing. Because if you really talk about baptizing, let's translate the word baptismo, where we get the word baptism in English, is the word baptismo, which meant to immerse. The only literal way to baptize someone is fully immerse them in water. Well, you can't legally do that to a baby. Some of the extreme Orthodox Catholic churches still do. It's insane that they would do that. But so there's a line that we haven't even approached here, is the definition of baptism. And it's not. So if you want to do it symbolically, well, the water is kind of pointless at that point, because it's not washing away anything, because you're talking about a child that hasn't become conscious yet. Conscious in the more philosophical context here, of themselves. They haven't, we call it the age of accountability. They haven't become conscious of a sin nature at all. I mean, the only thing they're conscious of is, feed me so I can pee and poop again.
Yeah. So I'll double advocate that, because you bring up the Greek term baptizo. It does mean to dip. Generally, in the vast majority of cases, it does mean to completely immerse. But there is a situation in the Old Testament, which, again, the Old Testament was originally in Hebrew, so you can take this for what it's worth. But in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, there's a situation in the Old Testament where there's a sacrifice. And you're supposed to get two birds, and you take one bird and you pretty well screw its head off its body, and you drain its blood out of its body into a bowl, and then you take the second bird and you dip the bird in the blood of the first bird. And the word that's used in the Bible, in the Greek Old Testament, is baptizo. And Paedobaptists have used that as an argument. They say, well, gracious, how much blood do you expect to be able to get out of this first bird that you would completely submerge the second bird in the blood of the first one? They say, no, that's not plausible to believe that you could possibly get that much blood out of the first bird. You would just have drops of blood on the second bird, or perhaps dunk it in a not submerged sense. That is a very weak argument, but that's an argument. And one of the things, I grew up listening to George Carlin. And you remember George Carlin?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So Carlin, he was an absurdist, and he had this bit about swearing on the Bible. And he said, you go into court and they make you, raise your left hand, put your right hand on the Bible, or something along those lines. And he talked about, why can't you just stand there and let your hands hang down by your side? Or what if you put your right hand in the air and your left hand on the Bible? Would that still count? Or what if the Bible was upside down? Or what if the Bible was really old and some of the pages had fallen out? Would that still count? Or what if the Bible was in a language that you couldn't read, like Chinese? Or what if you put your hands in your pockets and then swore on an upside down backwards Chinese Bible with half the pages torn out? Would that still count? And so you get the idea when you strip this apart. At some point, it's not the act of the thing that you're doing that matters. It's what you're trying to do through it. And so. To give an example, I worked at a church in East Tennessee for 3 years, and we had a young girl. There was actually a twin, but they had Down syndrome, and it was pretty severe. They were completely non-communicative, and although they were just cute as a button and very nice, pretty well mentally impaired. And their father was a 40-year pastor, was retired, and he had adopted them. And they were very young, but he talked to them about the Bible a lot, and they kept up as well as they could. And at one point, one of them, I suppose, made a profession of faith to the best of her ability to do so. But she was deathly ill, or deathly afraid of water. And I suppose it was something along the lines of water on her face specifically was a big trigger for her. And this guy, he was old school, and so he believed baptism is baptism. You get immersed. And so she got in the baptismal pool with him. And he started the process, and she was very calm until he started to lean her back and put her in the water, and she started to flail, and she's drowning. In her mind, she's drowning now, and her dad is going to drown her. Like you could see it in her face. She was so panicked. And the guy he was considering, I guess, well, we're already here. I might as well go ahead and just get her under, because we're not going to do this again. And so in a sense, I mean, as you're watching this, you're literally watching a man trying to drown a girl. That's what's happening. She is doing everything she can to not go under, and he's doing everything to get her under. And you're watching this guy drown a girl with Down syndrome. Because he's headstrong on the fact baptism is immersion. And I can see it in your face, and you know that it's in my voice as well. That's wrong. Like there's not a Baptist in the world that should be borderline drowning a girl with Down syndrome, because baptism is immersion.
Right.
And so when we say that out loud, the Paedobaptist goes, well. How do you justify being okay over here and different over here? And we would say, well, the case clearly would justify using one or the other. If you're in Saudi Arabia, where it's illegal to become a Christian, and you don't have a baptismal pool or a bathtub that would actually submerge someone, pouring a glass of water on their head might have to suffice. You just have to work with what you've got. But we would say that's because the conditions require it. John baptized where there was a lot of water on purpose. The eunuch that Philip baptizes is baptized somewhere that there was much water. That's noted on purpose. So we know the way that it's supposed to be done. The word clearly indicates to us what's supposed to be done. There may be circumstances where exceptions are warranted, but I don't think that the regular practice can be sacrificed. The same reason, if you're a college student and you're trying to take communion for the first time ever, and you make the mistake and you say, well, I will use wine and bread, but all I've got is pizza crust and grape soda. But I'm going to try to make it work. Mm-hmm. You might be forgiven of making that mistake your first time and doing your best. But that's not the way that we should start doing it across the board. We're not going to have pizza and soda and call it communion.
So let me back up a little bit. There's a lot we could talk about in the last 30 seconds of what you said. As far as the woman the woman with Down syndrome goes, so there's a couple of things to notice here that I think are clear. The first thing is, and especially talking about the people that, in a third world Middle Eastern country where it may be completely illegal to become a Christian, so they can't just go out and be baptized publicly. Obviously, that is true, and the Bible also makes it clear that we serve a God that is full of grace. And when I make that statement, I want to be careful not to give the wrong idea that I'm saying that God gives this special grace to special people and not everybody. Because the grace we're talking about in this context is not based upon a salvation. It's not salvific. It's not tied to your salvation. Your baptism doesn't save you. I'm sorry to those people in my life that believe that, but baptism does not finish the process of salvation. Baptism does not seal your salvation. Baptism is not part and parcel with your confession of your sin. Baptism is a completely separate work that is done post-salvation. And like we said earlier, we don't want to make a habit of advertising this because people take it the wrong way. You don't have to be baptized to go to heaven, but you should want to be. Why? Because God prescribed it. What was baptism? It was an outward confession of an inward work. And is there grace for the person that is mentally incapable of being immersed under water? Absolutely, because we don't serve a sadist. We serve a God that is full of grace. And I think that needs to be understood, that God is not... We're majoring on the minors and minoring on the majors in this conversation, really. God isn't sitting on his throne saying, oh, they didn't do things exactly as I said to do it. They used Welch's instead of wine, and my word says to use wine, in the thing of communion. Well, okay, what brand? What ABV is the wine supposed to be? Is it white or is it a Cabernet? Is it can I use a Moscato if that's all I've got? Josh Sellers or Kendall Jackson. I mean, I'm sound like I'm joking, but I'm really not, because you end up in the weeds with this, and you end up overanalyzing everything. And you end up turning it into this ritualistic practice rather than the holy thing that it was intended to be. And before you know it, you're not doing it because of the significance that it has to the spirit of man and our connection with God and our demonstration of faith. You're doing it to fulfill a duty, and it's lost all of its significance.
Yeah, and I think that you make a good point about how that this is, as much as we would like to make it a major, and by all means, we certainly have. We've got an entire denomination called Baptist. So we have made this about as big of a deal as you can possibly make it. It is nevertheless at the best secondary issue. This you could make a strong argument that baptism is a tertiary issue, because you could sit into church with people that are Paedobaptists and agree with every single thing they believe until you get to the issue of baptism.
Yeah,
and I certainly do. That's why I said that earlier about my Presbyterian buddies. We can sit around and talk about soteriology or eschatology or ecclesiology, and we're spot for spot. We are going to be in line with each other all the way until we get to the issue of baptism. So it's a minor, and it's a shame. There's a guy that I met at the conference that you were at back in September, Stephen Baker, who was actually like the mid-range guy. He was the one that had this.
He's the one that made the comment that I mentioned early on in the episode tonight, that mentioned at that conference about the Reformed view of Paedobaptism. He's the one that made that statement that made me perk up, because I'd never heard that before.
Yeah. But Stephen, he was a very interesting person to meet, and I'm really glad that I met him, because he's a fantastic guy. We talked a lot about fatherhood, but he mentioned early on that his church is it doesn't distinguish between Paedo and Credobaptist. He has both within his church, and even both on the leadership team. And so I told him, this is the wording I would use, and this tells you what kind of a crude person I am. I'm not academic. I said, your church must be so weird, because I have never even I can't imagine being at a church and sitting in the congregation and watching them baptize a baby, and then being like, all right, yeah, now we're gonna just go back to doing church. I mean, I everything in me would be like, stop, like, quit it, like.
Get the water away from the step away from the baby.
Right. And so like I'm amazed that his church works. And it should though. That's the thing. It should work. It should be the case that Christians who disagree on minor issues can come together and worship together. That should be the case.
Mm-hmm. It should be, but again, like you said, we've made major issues out of minor issues. Even the entire Baptist denomination exists because of our stance on baptism and it being believers' baptism, and that, we don't believe in Paedobaptism. That's why we're called Baptists.
Right. That and congregationalism. Chance made the point in the comment section there that the ecclesiology of Presbyterians is much different. Their concept of having a presbytery is significantly different. But aside from that, the concept of having a plurality of elders, what the qualifications for an elder are, at least within the PCA, the PCUSA, they're not even Christian. But you have the mainstream PCA, the people that actually are confessional. I wouldn't have hardly any disagreements with them other than getting very into the weeds about the presbytery. But Chance asked the question here. Let me throw this question to you: would you allow a Presbyterian to take communion at your church? That would be. I'll let you go ahead and answer that one.
It's a good question, and I think I'm going to answer this. I'm going to answer this in the best way I can, and I would apply this to anybody because, quite frankly, I probably wouldn't ask them when they came in the door if they were a Presbyterian. I don't hold.
That conversation would be fantastic.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Corey. I'm the pastor. What's your name and where do you come from and what do you believe? That's not typically the way I begin an introduction at a church. So I'm going to put myself in the position and say I'm getting ready to serve communion, or it's provided, and there's, say, some folks there that I don't know. Let's just say that I'm at a large church. Say there's 500 people in our congregation and we're going to have communion. I've probably personally not vetted all 500 people. And a lot of my Baptist brothers will disagree with me on this because they would consider themselves either close communion, meaning that they believe that the members of their church and people that are members of other churches that are like them, in other words, other Baptist folks, can partake in their church. And then there is the closed view of communion, which is only the members of our church, because we've vetted these people, we know that they're saved, we've walked with them, we've seen their profession of the gospel and their baptism, or at the least we've communed with them long enough that we have evidence to prove that they are saved. I am more of the belief of an open communion. Meaning I don't believe the Bible prescribes me to, I don't believe it's my responsibility to make the choice for you if your heart is ready for that. You have to obviously make that choice, just as you have to make the choice for your salvation. So when Paul talks in Corinthians about partaking of the supper, he says, that you don't bring damnation on yourself. It was obviously a very important thing. It was a holy thing, but he said, examine yourselves. He didn't say examine each other. He said, examine yourselves. And he left that to each person. So I think each person has to examine themselves. This is the same, in a very short version, this is the same thing I would say before I begin the serving of communion. And I would tell everybody, look, you you really want to go down that rabbit hole right now, Chance? Can we get through this one first before we jump into the next one? Good grief, man. One thing at a time. So, that being said, after a person is saved, I think that they need to make that choice for themselves. They need to decide, is my heart right? I need to examine me. I don't need to worry about examining everybody else. I need to examine me. After I've examined myself, that's on me. It's not me as the and I'm talking about that in the context of the individual. It's not my job as the pastor to make sure that your heart is ready. It's my job to prepare you as best as I can, but then it's your responsibility to prepare yourself. And if you believe that you are biblically acceptably able to partake in this, that's up to you. You know your heart in a way that I don't. So, would I allow a Presbyterian to take communion at my church? Absolutely, because I'm going to present the gospel. I'm going to present the purpose of communion, and I'm going to then leave that at their feet to take that personal responsibility that I can't take for them. You want to jump in on that, Michael, before I jump into the next can of worms that Chance is trying to derail this whole thing. It's kind of fun, but let's just get off this train before we jump on to the next.
Yeah, I think Chance works at a church there in. It's not far from me, actually. I think he's hooked up. If I'm thinking of the right guy, I think he's hooked up with a guy named Austin Weiss, who pastors the church pretty close to me. And they're solid, and they're good guys, and I hope that they have all manner of success down there. But as far as the question, would I allow a Presbyterian to take communion at our church? Before we take communion at Antioch, we always say this is a practice for baptized believers. And if you're a baptized believer and you again have examined yourself, you feel as though your soul is in an appropriate condition to take communion, then we're not going to bar that from you. Now, Chance actually brings up another. So to the point of the question, I'm not going to say if you were baptized by a Baptist, then you can take communion. But if you were baptized by a Methodist, you just sit in the back and be quiet for a while. I wouldn't say that. But he brings up another good question about church discipline. And this is something that Southern Baptists are just discovering exists, is church discipline. We forgot about it for about 2 years.
There's a chapter between Matthew 17 and 19. I heard there's a whole chapter between 17 and 19.
Even in the King James, it's there. So yeah, we've had to rediscover that, and we're having to figure it out. And so we actually have never had a case of church discipline go so far as for me to feel like I needed to fence communion. That's a common term for it, by the way. If you refuse to allow somebody to take communion, they call it fencing it. So I've never actually had communion from somebody in church discipline. Now one of the things that I do at my church that's probably a little bit different from the normal churches is before we take communion, I actually give people about 5 or 10 minutes to step out of the sanctuary and go make phone calls or step across the sanctuary and apologize. Because I actually believe that if you harbor hatred in your heart, if you offended somebody, or somebody has offended you, that you're drinking damnation unto yourself. And so when we take communion, I full stop the whole service. And before deacons ever touch a plate, I say, no, if you need to go call somebody, you go call somebody. And I've come down out of the pulpit before, because we've had times where there's been these people, the old crotchety woman who just really gets under your skin at the church, and even as the pastor, you're praying imprecatory prayers for her, if you think about her, it just kind of makes your blood boil. And there was a woman at our church that I don't know what had happened, but it had really upset me. And she was there, and we were about to take communion, and it was just burdening me because I was like, I'm going to end up having to step out of the pulpit right now and go make peace with this woman before I can come up here and distribute communion as the pastor. And so I did. I actually had to go and apologize to her for the way that I was thinking about her, and the way that I guess spoken. I think I agree with you that each individual is responsible for that themselves. But there is an element where at some point you'd have a responsibility to execute church discipline, and that would at some point. So let me put it to this degree, Corey, and then we can maybe look at Chance's question. Because means of grace we talked about towards the beginning, and I talked about what that would mean. Most Baptists probably say no, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to ask you this question before I forget it. If there was a family at your church that say had a litter they have 4 or 5 kids, and they're all under five. Okay. And you see mom kind of collecting the grape juice, of wine, and a couple of different pieces of bread to hand it down to little children who have not made it for faith, and they don't understand what's happening. Would you talk to her after service?
I would, because I would, in the very least, I would politely ask, hey, I seen the whole family took communion. Have all the children already accepted Christ at such a young age? That's great, and at least open that dialogue. And if the response was, well, no, then prime opportunity there to share the gospel and, minister to her, and, for her to minister into her children. But maybe mention, the significance of this, and, not to help the parent, not to cheapen this for the child. I'll say this. I heard a church recently make the statement, after COVID, after they've got back into the full swing of things, with their church, pardon me. Someone asked the question, why are we going to start having communion in kids' church on Sunday? And they have a large children's department. And that's the day I learned that they were partaking in communion. The whole kids department was taking, or at least the ones that wanted to. It was available for them. And I'm talking young kids, about 5, that were being served communion. And it's like there wasn't this clear definition of this is for the believer. This is for the baptized believer. It was literally, I've heard this church say, this is for everyone. And they just made this blanket statement. This is for everyone. And that really bothered me, because there was no specificity of what this is for. Now, I say that, and this is going to kind of round me back to what I said earlier about the 3 views of communion: open, close, and closed. It's churches that do that do not what we would call fence the table. It's churches that don't fence it at all, that don't differentiate in who this is for, that make churches be closed and say only the people that are members of our church are allowed to partake, because they don't want to fall into that ditch. But I think they're just jumping to the opposite side of the the other extreme in doing that. They're missing the middle ground where they should be. So they're just jumping away from that very liberal view of communion and that very cheap view of it, versus jumping now to this very, very almost legalistic view of it. So I think that as a pastor, long way to answer a question. I think that as a pastor, it's our responsibility to have that conversation with that mother and give some clarity to that situation.
Yeah, and kind of getting on the road towards the last question here. Not that it's the last one he's allowed to ask, but
you've used your allotment, Chance.
Right. I used to know a kid in school, and he talked so much that he had a word count. The teacher would give him like, you get to speak 30 words today, and it would be we'd count. So anyway, not doing that.
I didn't know you and I went to school together. I never noticed you.
Let me ask this to get on the road there. What view of communion do you take? Do you consider it purely symbolic, like a memorial, or do you think that there's some real presence there?
I obviously I don't hold to a transubstantiation view where, the belief that the bread and the cup literally become somehow magically through some spiritual force become the literal blood and flesh of Christ. That is absurd to believe that. I absolutely do believe that it's holy. I believe that it is representative. I believe that it is demonstrative. And I believe that it holds a great weight with God. I mean, it has to, in order to validate such a claim as not to drink this the claim that Paul made to the church, don't drink this unworthily or you bring damnation on yourself. That's a big statement if it's only a memorial. How far does that go? I don't know that I can answer that, to be quite frank. I don't want to try to speak to something that I can't speak to. But I don't believe that it stops at a mere memorial. But I don't believe it goes as far as the unorthodox idea of transubstantiation.
Yeah, I'd probably be in line with you there, although I'd be comfortable saying that I'm a memorial guy. But there's a view that John Calvin held that's called symbolic instrumentalism, and it's not as complicated as it sounds. He believed that the bread and the wine were not in any sense literally the body and the blood of Jesus in the way that Luther held or the way that the Catholics hold. Luther had, like I said, consubstantiation, and it's really hard, to distinguish between what he believed and what the Catholics believe. But Calvin's view was that you don't have to be in the same room with the sun to feel the heat of the sun, right? You can be millions of miles away from the sun and still feel the heat of the sun. You're not anywhere close to it, but you're feeling the presence of the sun. And in the same way, he held with communion. When you take communion, you're not in any sense actually holding the body of the blood of Christ, but you are experiencing His presence through that act.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty tempting view. I don't think that it's a world apart from the memorial view, though, because when Christ says, "Do this in me," and then we sit there and we're supposed to meditate on what we're doing, take ourselves back 2,000 years, and sit there in the room with Him, and think about what He's doing. He's going to be arrested the next few hours. He's having a meal with us, remembering the Passover, the blood of the Lamb saved from death, and He's the Lamb of God, sent to shed His blood. Actually do what He told us to do, and we do this in remembrance of Him, and think about what He did. I don't think that a memorial view is any less sacred than what Calvin's contended for. I don't think that there's any need to have the physical presence of Jesus there for us to feel His. I don't want to I just want to use the word presence again. He doesn't have to be present for us to feel his presence.
Right.
If we're truly memorializing him in the way that we ought to be. And that gets to the question of whether communion is a means of grace or not. And I would say yes. Even as a memorial view guy, I would say taking communion, it brings you closer to God. You receive grace through it. By taking communion, you get closer to God by sitting and meditating in the memorial view at least. By sitting and meditating on the act of Christ on that night and what this represents. So I would say yes. Go ahead.
I think if you're not careful, sometimes. Let me go ahead and read Chance's comment here. I'd say there is a memorial aspect. However, there is also a future aspect of eating with Christ. So communion is more than a memorial. It's a past grace to reflect on, but a future grace to look forward to. I wouldn't disagree with that. I just want to make clear that the initial question is communion a means of grace. If you're not careful, some would take that to mean, is communion a way to enter into grace? And that I would reject, because communion is obviously something that comes after you have entered a covenant of grace into salvation. Communion would not be a means of grace in that context. By taking it, it's not going to bring a person that is out of spiritual communion into communion with God, because communion was intended as a demonstration to the believer that was in communion with God already of the depth of that communion and the intent that God has in that communion with them, and the importance and significance of that relationship with Christ. So communion is again, as baptism, it is a post-salvation ordinance. And that's one of the big Baptist distinctives, is we believe in two ordinances of the church, baptism and the Lord's Supper. And those are both post-salvation ordinances. Those were given to the church, but the church obviously being the bride of Christ, the saved believer in communion with God. So when we say, is communion a means of grace, I think we have to be careful in how we define that question. I'm not sure I really know how to answer this. Would you say it's a sustaining grace?
Yeah, I'm not overly familiar with theology either.
I'm not sure either. So if you want to maybe explain that a little bit, Chance. He said, or
we're just going to keep putting new adjectives in front of the word grace.
Yeah. Chance, I started this podcast off by saying, talk to me like I'm five, and you're using more than 3 syllables in a word, and I get very confused. Dr. Shultz needs bigger words, so you're going to have to find a middle ground here. I thought you had an honorary doctorate at this point already. You should, if you don't.
I haven't earned a doctorate. Nobody's honored me with one yet. But I have earned one.
You have earned one.
I'm working on a second one.
And I will say this. I appreciate the fact that you don't tote around the name Dr. Michael Shultz. People actually kind of have to drag that out of you. And I appreciate the humility that you have, even though you have attained a thing so highly as a doctorate. At least you got your doctorate, and you didn't happen across it. Someone didn't give you the honorary doctorate.
Well, yeah. And I think that there's a time and a place for it. So, like, I teach at this seminary in North Carolina, and I'm completely comfortable with the students referring to Dr. Shultz. But in a church context, I don't think there's any place for it. I really don't. I think that title is something that should be secular. If you want to call me pastor, that's fine. That's fine. I'm not overly comfortable with the term reverend. To be honest with you. But I like pastor. And at my church, everybody calls me brother. Just because we're Southern. And so we don't. If somebody calls me Pastor Michael, I know that it's because they're distinguishing between me and one of my deacons, who's also named Michael. If they just say Brother Michael, that doesn't really help them at all. Oh gosh.
I thought you would have
Take that.
Take that down. So I guess since we've jumped in here and this was asked, I'm not going to leave Chance just hanging. The question that he asked earlier, he said, we make the choice for ourselves. Are you reformed? Chance, you clearly came in late to the show, but we'll give you some grace since grace is the theme tonight. And no, I am not reformed. I'm also not a Arminian that believes that I get it by myself. I would probably put myself more in the traditionalist, or if you want to call it provisionist camp, where I do not believe in the tulip. I don't believe that salvation is completely outside of us, where we have no choice in the matter. But I believe that though God is divinely provident, and though God is the one that draws us to himself, that he still gives man a free will, that we are still given the choice to make by our own will to serve God. And I don't believe that we're held captive in our salvation. So yeah, no, and it was funny because we talked about deformed theology. Funny. That's a new one. I've never heard deformed theology before. I like that. I'll take that. And I said it was funny, the conference that me and Michael met at, which we had known each other for a while prior, but we had never physically met until that conference. I said it was strange because out of about 150 people that were in that building, I'm pretty sure I was maybe one of the only 2 people there that weren't reformed, and that's because the other one was 3 months old and hadn't decided yet. So it was interesting being in that place, in that conference, and I was probably the only not happily Calvinistic guy there.
That kid was probably baptized, so you can't really count them either.
All right.
It's interesting though, because when you talk in the Reformed community, this is one of my favorite things to do, is to actually maintain connections with people that are not reformed. Because the Reformed community is turning into this very navel-gazing kind of community. We're not talking to people that aren't reformed. And like you ask a reformed guy, who are the people that are writing books he's reading? He's not reading anybody that's not in the reformed camp.
Right.
And to be honest, that's a shame. That's pitiful.
It is.
Because you're going to say that every Christian who's not a believer of Calvinism is just worthless.
Right.
That's silly.
And it would be just as silly for me to say.
Go ahead.
Sorry, a counterpoint to that, it would be just as silly for me to say that every person that is a Calvinist or that's a Reformed believer should not be listened to. I mean, there's a lot of guys that I like. I've got guys that I like to listen to preach, guys that I respect, and they're Reformed in a lot of their beliefs. But again, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm not going to become so dogmatic that I say, well, if you don't agree with my thoughts 100%, then I just can't associate with you, listen to you, talk to you. I don't want to be that narrow of a person.
Yeah, and it is. It's greatly hampering. Like, how can you grow as a Christian? Mm-hmm. I read heretics, he says. Well, that's fair.
I mean, and I'll say this.
I guess I am. You brought up a brush.
I read heretics, Arminians, and Reformed theology. I guess I'm the heretic here because I'm not Reformed or Arminian, so I guess I'm a heretic. Wow. Okay.
Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll, though. Here's to bring up a heretic. Mark Driscoll had a statement here recently that had a twinge.
He had a lot of statements.
Yeah, right. He said that a lot of these young restless and reformed guys like to read Puritans and old dead Calvinists because they don't have anybody to be accountable to.
Mm.
And that's again broad brush stroking. But there's something there where we have a bunch of young guys who they believe everything right. They have their doctrine right. Of course, I would say as a reform guy. They have their doctrine reformed. We'll put it that way. And I would agree with them. But they're completely intolerant of anybody that's not 100% agree with them. And that's kind of what the conference was about in September, where like I was talking to a guy. I'm an admin page called Teaching, and it's got something like 35,000 people that are a part of it, and something like 8 admins. So we talk all the time about different coming and going. And one of the guys in the group was talking last night about eschatology, and we quickly found out that all of the admins had different eschatological views. We've got a couple of guys that are post-mill, a couple of guys that are on-mill, and me and a couple of buddies that are pre-mill. And we got into that discussion, and there was a moment where I could see it turning really belligerent. Like the post-mill guy and one of the on-mill guys were getting seriously into an argument. Yeah. Hashtag post-mill.
I wonder where he falls in that discussion.
Yeah. But it is to the point where we are looking with such a big magnifying glass for some way that people disagree with us. And then at the moment we find whatever disagreements there is, okay, well, you're going to hell then. There's a story about that. When I was at seminary, and by the way, I went to dispensational seminary. I got my master of ministry and my doctor of ministry at a Dispy seminary, and then I did my MDiv at Liberty University, which is pretty well Dispy. And I'm looking at PhD programs, and some of the better ones that I'm looking at are have at least dispensational histories. But when I was doing my master's, there was a story that one of the professors told where there were two guys stranded on islands, and the island close enough that they could see and hear each other, but not close enough that they can make the swim. And so one of the guys shouted over, and what's your name? John, what's your name? Tom. And it's Tom. And Tom says, well, Tom, are you a theist? And he says, yeah, I'm a theist. And he says, what God do you believe in? And he says, I believe in Yahweh, the God of the Bible. And he says, so you're a Christian. And he says, yeah, I'm a Christian. And he says, what kind of Christian? And he says, well, I'm a Protestant. And he says, cool, me too. I'm a Protestant Christian theist. What denomination do you belong to? And he says, well, I'm a Baptist. And the guy says, cool, I'm a Baptist and Christian theist as well. What kind of Baptist are you? And he says, I'm a missionary Baptist. And he says, cool, I'm a missionary Baptist, Protestant, Christian, so on and so forth. And about 30 minutes later, the guy says, so what confession do you hold to? And he says, I hold to the Baptist Faith and Message 2000. And he says, I hold to the Baptist Faith and Message 1996. You're a heretic.
Yeah, right.
And so we'll keep going down this road forever, even in non-goals where we're going to try to find what small difference we can, and hopefully in the future we can have churches like Stephen Baker's where there's an element of ecumenicism that's within orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree.
You gotta take doctor off of it.
But you are. I don't know why you've got such a problem with being recognized for who you are. You have earned that doctorate. You should allow someone to recognize you from time to time. It's funny that you told that joke because I was literally typing in my phone as you started to talk, and then I didn't realize this is where you were going. I have the same I was pulling the same exact joke up that I have saved in my phone, except the end result was it was two men are on a bridge and one's about to jump and the other's trying to talk him out of it. The man asks the jumper, "So are you a Christian or a Hindu or a Jew or what?" The jumper says, "I'm a Christian." The man says, "Hey, small world, me too. Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox?" The jumper says, "I'm Protestant." The man replies, "Me too. What denomination?" The jumper says, "Baptist." The man replies, "Me too. Southern or Northern?" The jumper says, "Northern." The man says, "Me too. Northern Conservative or Northern Liberal?" The jumper says, "Northern Conservative." "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region?" The jumper says, "Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region." "Me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Council of 1912? The jumper says, "Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Regional Council of 1912. The man then pushes the jumper off the bridge and screams, "Die, you heretic." And this is kind of what we do. You know, I've heard the statement that Christians are the only ones that shoot their wounded. And we do this. We will agree on 99 places, and then when one place of disagreement comes, oh, I've got to disassociate with you because, you know, we disagreed on open and closed communion. You know, I can't go to your church because you don't use a King James. I can't go to your church because y'all don't believe the beliefs that I hold on whatever thing that holds no salvific value, that holds no gospel altering value. And that's really where we're at is, you know, and you mentioned this earlier, not by name, but you said, you know, this isn't a first or second tier problem. And that kind of goes back to the Al Mohler book, Theological Triage, where he talks about, you know, first, second, and third tier matters. I think, or first order, second order, and third order, I think is the way he put them. And we've made everything a first order problem. Everything is first order. Everything is salvific in our minds, when most things aren't. Most things are probably second, if not third order. They really don't matter in the grand scheme of things in our ability to fellowship together, worship together, communicate together, and try to share the gospel together. But every minor disagreement we have, we make a first order matter. Every minor becomes a major. In the discussion that we started having tonight of Paedobaptism versus Credobaptism, is that a first order issue? Should we, you know, and let me throw you that question before I answer it. Should we disfellowship with someone? Should I stop going to a church if they practice Paedobaptism? Is that something we can get around? Is that a second order issue, or is that a first order issue?
Well, I want to approach that different question because in the American context at least, we start with where we're at. If you're at a Presbyterian church and you agree with 99% that they believe, let's say you're reformed like me, and you're at a Presbyterian church and they're reformed, but you're convinced of Paedobaptism. If there are no Reformed Baptist churches around that are going to have 99% or greater that you actually believe true, then you'd be just as well stay at the Presbyterian church. Because let's say if I live in the town that you live in, Corey, and you're pastoring a church that's Baptist, and I'm a Southern Baptist, but I'm heavy metal Calvinist. I mean, I am cage staging, and I believe that everybody should be Calvinist, and the gospel is John Calvin. If I'm one of those guys, and I'm going to a Presbyterian church that's Reformed, I might be able to listen to the pastor preach and agree. But if I disagree with them on baptism, then I come up to your church where you're not Calvinist. And I'm going to disagree more of what you're saying than what that Presbyterian was saying. I would say stick with the place where you have the most agreement. And in that sense, baptism is not an issue to divide over. But if you're somewhere where you've got a church that's a Baptist that believes everything you do, or a Presbyterian believes most all of what you do, with the exception of baptism, go to the Baptist church. Split the thing backwards. If you're a Paedobaptist sitting in a Baptist church, you say, "Well, I really agree with their soteriology. I really agree with eschatology. But I don't like that they don't baptize babies, and I really like to baptize my kids." And I would probably. I don't know. That would be a very hard situation for me. As a Baptist, I could never advise somebody to baptize their kids. And I'd be confusing them on something that I think is pretty clear. But if that's a conviction that a person has, I wouldn't want to leave our church over it.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I guess I don't see it as very high on the scale there.
Okay. I would politely probably disagree, and I would say that for me, baptism would be a first order issue. It would be something that I would have to separate with the church from. Again, going back to maybe it's a slippery slope type idea that I'm inserting into it. With my earlier thought of, when you do this, you imply a lot of things that have to be dealt with down the road. Maybe that's slippery slope ideology, that which tends to border on conspiracy theories, but I'm not that crazy. I would not be comfortable sitting in a church that is going through some ceremony that involves the baptism of an infant beyond the clearly relayed, we're going to pray over this child that's been born, thank God for it, and pray God's blessing over it. Beyond that, if there was some baptismal-like ritual taking place that made some salvific implication in any way, I don't think I could sit under that, because for me that offends the true gospel, and that is completely out of order, and I feel like I would have to remove myself from that to a church that let me put it this way. I would rather sit under a pastor that is a Calvinist than I would sit under a pastor that's baptizing babies. Because we may disagree. You and I may disagree about the methodology and about the means of attaining salvation, but we still preach the same salvation, the same gospel. And in the end, at the end of the day, we might disagree on Calvin, but we agree on how on a person coming to Christ. Whether we disagree on how they came to Christ and, well, did God work it out all himself, or did God work it out with me, or is it completely in my hands? All of that at the end of the day is kind of irrelevant as long as we can say that someone has followed the biblical guidelines of declaring Christ as Lord, and they've answered a call to repentance, and they have called Christ Lord and rendered themselves to him, and they have been truly saved. That's all that matters. So I think I would be better off in a Reformed church than I would a church that's baptizing babies, because of the implications that makes.
I can see how that conflicts with you, and it is. I have to say, it is because of the way that you are. The way that you're receiving paedobaptism, you're extracting from it a meaning that's not intended. Now you would probably say, well, that's certainly implied and fair,
Right.
That's fair. But I don't think that a Paedobaptist would ever say that the baptism that they're applying to children has anything salvific about it. And you be fair to say, quit doing it. But I think that. Go ahead.
Some people may call that splitting hairs. Some people may say, well, it's semantics. I don't. Maybe that's my propensity to overread things kicking in there. But I just truly believe that, words matter, what we do matters, and I think implications matter. And I think that it's important that we avoid the possibility of false implications so that someone isn't led astray by an implication. And if something implies something opposite of what is true, then I think we need to reevaluate how we do this or how we present this so as not to do so. Therefore, I would have to look, if I was a Paedobaptist with that thought, I would then have to say, okay, now I need to reevaluate this so that I don't make a salvific implication. Well, now if I did that, in my mind, this is the logic I'm following, I would end up going from being a Paedobaptist to just praying God's blessing over babies and doing dedications. But I feel like that distinction has to be made so that we don't give unnecessary implications.
Yeah, and I would also want to clarify one thing with you, because at the beginning of your statement there that we consider this more of a first order issue. That's probably not what you mean, because first order issues where if you're wrong about these, you're not a Christian. So like first order issues like things like disbelieving in the Trinity, denying the deity or the humanity of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
If you reject those, you're not even a Christian. And so second,
I wouldn't.
That's why I said earlier.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it on the level of heretical. I wouldn't say it's heretical. I would just say it's questionable. And it's
so that would be, and that's why I said earlier, this could either be considered a secondary or even a tertiary issue. Because it's important, but it's not to the point where you would say, well, if you're Presbyterian, going to hell. Right. Because I'm certain you wouldn't say that.
No.
Neither would I.
No.
And I would probably have more. It's funny for me to hear you say I would be more comfortable with a Calvinist than a Presbyterian. Because for me, I'm like, forget that. I could never go to an Arminian church nowadays. Like, there's no way. I could not sit under a pastor that was teaching non-reformed soteriology. There's no way I can sit under that pastor. And again, it's as much as I hate to say it, and as much as the young restless guys would like to reject it, you've made a good point. That's a secondary issue. If somebody's not a Calvinist and they believe full-fledged, we'll say semi-Pelagianism, where salvation is synergistic, where you work together with God, and it happens that way. A Calvinist believes that salvation is monergistic. God does everything. Most other belief systems are synergistic. God initiates the process, and then you kind of accept it of your own free will and buy in. If you want to use that terminology. That kind of is secondary. People that disagree on those issues are both Christians, and they're both going to heaven. And this uncomfortable moment when we get there, as Christ is explaining to us where our error was on one side or the other or both. But we'll be there. And I don't think that I'm having this debate right now with some guys because this is about canceling church on Christmas. There are so many people that are saying if your church is canceling church on Christmas, find a new church. And I'm like, are you 11 years old? 11 years old?
Absolutely absurd.
You're gonna leave. This is pathetic.
Yep.
Like
Absolutely
it is.
absurd.
And so to disfellowship yourself with the body of Christ that you've made a commitment to because they canceled church one week is pathetic.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're seeing, and it's in every camp. The reform camp. Perhaps the worst about it because they're saying, well, if somebody doesn't value the Lord today more than they do Christmas, then they're not a real church. I had one guy tell me. He said that if you cancel church on Christmas, you were not a newly constituted church. It wasn't a real church. And I thought, what a load of crap.
Yeah.
Like that's such garbage.
Yeah.
So we've go ahead.
I'm not going to argue with you and fight.
Well, we've got this issue where we have forgotten what you're talking about. Almol, these tiers, importance.
Mm-hmm.
If I may not agree with Pentecostal about very much at all. But I'm not going to say that they're not Christians. There's just much at stake for us. The problem right now, what the real issue is right now? We don't have real heretics running around right now. We don't have people that are claiming to be Christians and successfully convincing people that foundational Orthodox Christian truths are not true. So you have a guy like Stephen Furtick who says something stupid like God broke the law for love.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's really stupid. But to call him a heretic because he said that. You clearly have not experienced many heretics.
Exactly.
Because heretics are a problem. I mean, they are a serious problem. You have another guy like T.D. Jakes, who's a oneness Pentecostal, where they believe they reject the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
That's a heretic. But when you've used the word heretic to describe everybody from T.D. Jakes down to the Presbyterians across the street who baptize a baby, words lost its meaning. You can't actually convince anybody to avoid heretics. Everybody a heretic.
And let me jump in here and kind of be the voice of grace. This will get me in trouble, and I don't care. I don't know that I would go to the extent to say that if you don't believe in I wouldn't go to the extent to say that every oneness Pentecostal that doesn't believe in the Trinity is a heretic. I don't know that I would go to the extent to say T.D. Jakes is a heretic. I think like you said, I think the word heretic is used way too much, and I have really dialed down my usage of that word. But I don't even know that I would say that view is heretical. I think you could make an argument that T.D. Jakes is a heretic, but I don't know that I would say that his view of the Trinity is what makes him a heretic. I think when a person deviates from the gospel, when they deviate from the truth of Christ and a substitutionary atonement, I think that's heretical land. Whether or not God is one person, three persons in one, or three separate persons, I don't know that I would call that heretical. Yeah, I don't even know if that. I don't know. Are we still friends?
Well, I mean, I'm not. I'll stand 10 toes down and say that's around with the Trinity. I'm going to call you a heretic.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of the. I define heresy as variating from the historic creeds and confessions.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
it's,
I would agree with that. Okay, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So when you get into the Athanasian Creed, where they define the person of Christ, or the Nicene Creed, where they're defining the Trinity, if you're having a hard time agreeing with these creeds, it's not a good sign. Put it that way.
Right.
Put it that way. And now I get in hot water myself because I don't believe Jesus went to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And you read the Apostles' Creed, and it clearly says he descended into hell.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got an issue. I've got to come up with what are we talking about? What do we mean by that? And it matters. But there, I would even say that issue is not a primary issue. I use the expression before when I was teaching my church about this, that it's like a spider web. There are some doctrines that are on the outside of the spider web, toward the edges, and you can tinker with them and mess around it. It doesn't take the whole web.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some doctrines that are right in the middle of the web, and if you touch them, the whole web is going to move. And so you've got a doctrine like the Trinity, like you said, atonement. You mess around with those. The whole doctrine of Christianity. Your whole belief system is going to be different.
Right.
And so that's where I say, the heresies are found in the middle of the web. You go mess around with some of these. You're not just creating a little. You're changing the whole system.
And again, the statement you just made, if it go, that could affect everything. If heresy is based off of one thing affecting everything else, then it's kind of easy to then say, well, that explains why some Arminians would call a Calvinist a heretic and why some Calvinists would call the Arminian a heretic. Because that kind of affects everything. It's also kind of the reason that I'm in the middle and I call myself the traditionalist, and I don't take a Arminian or a traditionalist side because I think you both are off. I'm moderate in every aspect of my life. Apparently theologically, politically, I just sit in the middle. But I will say, I'm middle Reformed leaning. I'm not middle Arminian leaning.
Well, the Bible has a word for that kind of person.
Here we
it's
go.
Used in Revelation in particular.
It was coming. My name is Luke, and I'm very warm right now.
But no, I understand because there is a place for people that hold. When I was doing my associate's degree, I had a professor who was a historian, and he specialized in French history, and so he was super interested in France. And this was when Marie Le Pen prime over there, and her father was like pretty much a Nazi, and so they were worried that she was going to pretty well France into like Nazi France, and so. This other guy is still the prime minister. I don't know. I don't forget his name now. It's probably Pierre or something. But he won, and he was supposed to be centrist. And I remember my professor coming to me and said, "The center held." And he was so proud of that. That it wasn't the left and it wasn't the right that the center had held. And I'll never forget that because that actually really inspired me. Like you're saying, theologically, politically, wherever we fall, it's probably a good idea to try to just have the center hold.
Yeah, it is.
And as a Southern Baptist, I have to say that even right now. Now, as the wings get further apart. You have the left wing that's wild off the rails. You're going to also have the right wingers going wild off the rails too. And the center is going to be a whole lot bigger here soon.
Right.
So we're going to find some guys in the middle that are standing shoulder to shoulder with other guys in the middle. They used to be radical.
Yep. I think you're right because and I don't want to go political tonight. We can do that some other night. But in both atmospheres, in the religious world and the political world, the right is getting more and has become more and more radicalized. The left has become more and more radicalized, and the people on the outskirts of the left and the right are. The middle is becoming wider, as you said. And I think a lot of the world is recognizing. And I think if the truth be told, the radicals on both sides get all the press. And that goes for church life and political life. If you don't believe me, turn on TBN or CNN, and you'll see it on both networks.
Yeah.
And I've always said that there's that one extreme, and then there's that far other extreme, and truth tends to lie in the middle somewhere, which is where I've always kind of been, because I'm just not arrogant enough to jump to one extreme and say I've got it all right, I've got it all figured out, and everybody else is crazy. And I've got it figured out. When the majority of people are in the middle looking at both of the very small extremes that think they know everything. I've heard it said this way: if you're in a room and, there's a jerk in every room, and if you're in a room and you're looking around for the jerk, you're probably the jerk. I think that there's always that person who's always looking around for the person that's wrong. That's... well, if you can't find the person that's always wrong, it's probably you. If you can't find the guy that's got it figured out, it's probably you. So I think it would do us well to have some.
Everybody else is always wrong. That's not. That
doesn't mean I'm always right. No.
Right. I know these guys theologically say I've gone to 14 different churches. I just can't find one that is right. I'm thinking. You think everyone else is the problem?
Right.
Everybody else is wrong.
Yeah.
Couldn't possibly be me.
Yeah. It's like a guy that I know who he's I think been married 5 or 6 times, and the joke was did one guy get 5 bad women, or did 5 women get one bad guy? So, you decide. But what are the odds, right?
Right. At some point, you got to put the common denominators together and say, wait,
exactly.
There's one factor here that keeps pointing up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Michael, I think we have covered this one. It is almost 11:30. I think we've covered this topic. We could go on for another couple hours, but I should probably go to bed, and you should too. So,
I got a long. No.
Yeah, you do. It's like, you know what? Let me do you a favor. I just want to give you a report real quick. I know you're in Kentucky and I'm in Illinois, but where I'm at, it's -7. It's -7 right now outside. I'm trying to look for a wind chill, but I don't see it on my phone right now. Just know that it's really cold, and I'm going to make the long walk upstairs to my living room past my coffee pot while you're trying not to fall and break your tailbone. So I'm with you, bro. It's a long walk to the coffee pot. I know.
Well, I appreciate you having me, brother. It's always a joy talking with you. And
you too, man.
Not a lot of guys I can sit and talk with for 2.5 hours. Really agree. Great honor for me to talk with you, brother. I really enjoy it always. Hope that you and your family do well. Good luck. Praying for you with your baby coming on.
Yeah, thank you. I thank you. And you just had a baby. You just had another baby. Well, your wife just had a baby, right?
No, I did it. We're like seahorses. I did all. No, yeah. We've got a 3-month.
Good for you.
She's lovely.
And your other daughter is how old?
She'll be 3 January 1st.
3 and 3 months. 3 and a 3-month-old. Wow. We've got my boy just turned 6. My daughter is 5, and the wife is due in July, so my boy will be 7. So yeah, got all that coming. So it's getting interesting around our house. Yeah, getting ready to prepare on
Your kids go to
building
your kids go
nursery.
to school, right?
Yeah, my boy's in kindergarten this year. My daughter, she's not yet, but she'll be in kindergarten next year.
So you just had them out. Just had them starting over. You're starting over.
Yeah, right. I waited until I got rid of all the baby stuff to have another baby. So
Yeah,
I
I'm praying
appreciate
for you.
Anyone's prayers, and I also have PayPal. If you like to put your faith into action, I have PayPal and Venmo. All right, I got to get out of here, man. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This is on YouTube and Facebook now, so you guys can watch this. Probably do a more edited version that sounds a little bit better, and put on Apple and Spotify later. But for now, you guys that watch this kind of got in on the raw version of this, whether that was good or bad for you. Thanks again to Jordan Pride for the background music. Check him out on Apple, on Spotify, Jordan Pride. All right, it's Corey on Simply Said. Michael Shultz down in the cold, cold hills of Kentucky, and we're out of here. Love you guys. Be blessed. Bye-bye.